just realizing like, oh, we're doing this thing together and we're in this together and like we're excited to figure it out together.
That was really refreshing to be in a situation where I didn't feel like I had to pretend like I had all the answers.
There was a sense of like childlike play. Did we all just become best friends?
Hey friends, welcome to another Dreams of Education podcast with me, Kelly Tankley, and my friend and co-host,
Michelle Baldwin.
Michelle, today we thought we would talk about the joy of learning. And really at Anastasis, we saw that joy come through in spades. Like it just was overflowing. And I think that's what, when people came through Anastasis, that was the first thing that kind of struck them, is this just joy around what was happening in the building. And it didn't come by accident. I think a lot of what we have talked about in previous episodes gives some context to why that was, as far as different rituals we had and ways that we were setting things up. But I think what's interesting, being in the position I was in, we were obviously enrolling kids into our school. And the stories that I would hear, in these enrollment meetings were often, there's no joy. All the joy is gone. They hate learning. They're defeated. Their anxiety is through the roof. They're depressed. Like all of these kind of heavy, heavy things. And a lot of what we saw was this transformation. And it didn't take as long as I think sometimes we even assumed it might take.
Right.
But it really was so interesting to see that transformation happened, rooted in safety, belonging, community, and having adults who were willing to listen. So I thought we would talk today about some of that being social emotional learning, some of it just being how we were set up. I think I kind of cringe when I hear SEL, and it's not because I don't believe in it, but it's just because so often when we talk about SEL, it's talked about as this like bolt-on thing that now we're going to do this in addition to reading, writing, math. And for us, SEL is just the way that we experienced life every day at Anastasis. It was very much just part of what we were doing.
Well, and as we've said in many other episodes, educators love their acronyms. So SEL is social emotional learning. And again, in a lot of schools where that's added, it seems to take more of the character counts curriculum.
Yes.
And that's an extra thing that you do rather than making that part of your focus throughout all of the learning. And I wanted to go back to a couple of things that you said before when you were introducing this episode. One, that you'd heard parents come in and say that their children hated learning. And I think that was what they were perceiving was happening. Nobody really hates learning because learning in itself is pretty joyful.
I would agree. Yeah.
I think they hated what was done in the name of learning.
Yes, that's such a good distinction.
Yeah, because anytime you watch a kid learn something new, they get so excited and they call their friends over or they call the adults in their lives over and say, look what I could do.
Yeah.
And that makes me think of a skit that I won't bring up, but it was pretty funny. But it's like kids don't really hate learning. I think that what happens is, and especially since No Child Left Behind, we have done so much in the name of education or in the name of learning that is artificial. And it's cram a bunch of information, have the kids spit it back out, and that's supposed to be learning. And we know that is not what learning is. So again, the majority of teachers that we talk to, even in the systems where they don't have any choice, they don't like it any more than the kids do. So that part of it to me is they didn't really hate learning. They hated what they were experiencing in the name of learning. And what was so interesting to me is we would often get kids mid-year or partly through the year and their school picture from the previous school. And then we would take another picture of them like a month or two later, and it didn't even always look like the same kid.
In fact, we had parents who that exact experience, that right before they left the previous school, it was school pictures. They got their photo taken, and then ours was later in the year or later I think it was even just weeks away. But then the photo was taken at Anastasis, and it was the parent who brought it in and set both of them down
Side
on
by
the
side.
table side by side in the office. And she was like, look at the difference in my child's face, in his eyes, in his, like, this is not a real smile. His eyes look dull. It was such a remarkable difference that you could literally see, and that it was so striking to the parent that she's like, I got to bring this in and show everybody, because
right.
And it's the Anastasis effect. I don't know.
If that had only happened once or twice, I'd be like, okay, that's an outlier. But that happened often. And we often had parents remark upon their child just felt like they could breathe. And we've had kids say that literally to us.
I was going to say, we had alum come in to visit one day, and she sat down in the office and she said, oh, it feels so good here. It's like I can breathe again. And I was like, well, isn't that just joy?
And we can say that's the Anastasis effect, but honestly, anybody can do that. It really just
fully agree.
We have to change how we focus, what we're doing to kids. As we mentioned before in a previous episode, that there are side effects to the things that have been done in the name of education. So yes, we decided we were going to focus on standardized testing, and we prep for that. We have pep rallies for that, all of these things. And now we have kids who are more anxious than ever, more stressed out, and they're not performing, because who can perform to their best when they feel like that?
Well, I was going to say, like, there's even names for it, right? We call it the anxious generation. And it's like, right. Well, what is the root of that anxiety? And anxiety is not a new phenomenon. I mean, you and I both have experiences with anxiety in our past. My anxiety through school was not necessarily test related, because I found that to be the part that I understood, like I was pretty successful at, and I understood how the game worked. And so I didn't have a lot of stress around, I shouldn't say stress. There were times I was probably stressed. I didn't have a lot of anxiety around the test and that kind of structure. The anxiety I felt was more like, what is my place in this room? How do I relate to these other people? What are they thinking about me? It was more social than anything else. The kids that we see might have some social anxiety, but overshadowing everything is this anxious pressure that they come with, that I'm not enough. Right? Mm-hmm. There's this feeling of just, I'm not enough because I can't perform in the way that everybody the adults in my life are expecting me to. And I think about how much of that anxiety is coming from the adults and coming from the structures and the systems that we've put in place. And it's not that we're meaning to create that anxiety for kids, but purely based on what we as adults are focused on and paying attention to and talking about and hiring tutors for. Like, it all creates this anxiety and this pressure to perform at a certain level.
Right. All of what you just said makes me think back again. When you and I were in school, and we're about 10 years apart, I knew how to play the game of school. I was very good at it. I got really good test scores. It was never a big deal for me. But I can also say that I never heard anything about standardized test scores unless it was to me specifically and to my parents. My parents would talk about it, but it was like just the day that they delivered it and said, yes, this is what percentile you're in, and they move on. There was never any conversation from our teachers or our administrators saying, you have to do really well because our funding relies on this. So everybody has to have a good test score, which I have heard in schools in the last 15 years, even actually when my kids were in school.
No, I mean, tests, that type of testing when I was in school just meant we got orange juice before class.
We never had pressure. They just, they said, do your best. They did say this goes on your permanent record, but because that permanent record I've seen so often in my adult life.
Exactly. It's popped up so many times.
Hey, what did you get on that California achievement test when you were in 5th grade?
Yeah.
They did say do your best, but the pressure was different back then, minimal in my opinion, to what it is now, because we just didn't ever hear that there was funding attached to it. And when my kids would come home from school in the 90s and say, if we don't all get good grades on these tests, we might lose money for our school. And I'm like, who is telling these children this? Please don't do
even
that.
If it's not the school leaders, right? Even if it's not the school messaging, it's in the ethos of our community, I was just telling you off camera that the latest report came out that we're falling further and further behind, and it's as a result of COVID, where our test scores are still falling and we're still failing kids and all of these things. That's on the local news, right? So it's not even that they are only hearing that message or only possibly hearing that message at school. It's just in the ethos of like what is happening in this country, what they're hearing on the news, incidentally, overheard conversations, and they're feeling the anxiety that the adults are putting out because we're so hyper focused on the outcome of the test score.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we talked about stakeholders last week. We talked about outcomes. I think part of the issue is we're using the test as a stakeholder,
Mm-hmm.
which it should not be, right? The score as a stakeholder. And we're trying to get these outcomes without understanding the complexity of what is creating that outcome. So in other words, when we're talking about reading scores falling, we're not really just talking about a reading score. We're talking about all the other things that are true in that score, but are being ignored. And a lot of that is the social emotional.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that is the, how we're setting things up, the structures that we're putting in place, how we're teaching those subjects, but we're not really putting the right emphasis in the right place to understand what the problem is. And so I feel like we keep solving the wrong dang problem.
We are. I really do feel it, again, because you see kids who are struggling in any content area, they're more likely to be put into some kind of a remedial class. And then it's just, drill, keep learning that rather than to look, okay, what is the underlying issue and how can I help you to solve that may help you further along. And, we started off saying the joy of learning sometimes gets sucked out of that. I keep thinking like this analogy of learning to drive a car is kind of stuck in my head. If I were only ever allowed to read about it, my teacher showed me how to drive the car through diagrams, through video, through talking about it. And I had to take a bunch of tests that were written or oral or whatever, but I was never allowed to actually drive the car. So
Same with riding a bicycle, right?
Exactly.
You could
yes.
learn all the history of bicycles. You could learn the mechanics. You could learn everything about how to ride a bicycle.
Right.
And until you've actually found your balance on a bicycle, like you're not going to actually understand. You're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to perform that.
Well, there's muscle memory involved in all of those things. And I think that maybe we don't really look at reading or applying math facts or whatever content area you want to talk to about really engaging muscle memory, because it's a different kind of muscle that we're exercising. And again, I think maybe because like you would never try to teach someone how to play tennis by only showing them. You'd want them to do it so that you could then help coach.
Just feel the,
exactly. Right. And to gain that muscle memory. Well, with something like reading, because we use this one often, and that's the news that just came out yesterday. How do we look at giving a child time to sit with a book and physically feel that book and not just read an excerpt on a page or something on a screen, but to physically have something in their laps that they're looking at the pages, their eyes are tracking in a different way. I mean, there is a lot of muscle. Maybe that's just not the term I should be using. Muscle memory is a good term.
I think there's something there, though. I think you're right. The other piece that I like about that analogy is, why do we learn to drive a car? Like, what is the joy that brings us, right? It brings us freedom. It brings us new opportunities to go explore. Same thing with a bike, right? It's the joy of, I can now ride this bike, which means I can go see my friends. I can explore the neighborhood. Like, there's all these other joys that come with learning that you're right. If you're just learning it from a book, the actual joy of why you would learn that is not attached at all. And so it's like
the independence of it too, right?
Yeah.
Because that's something, if you're constantly being read to. I love reading to children, but I also really know that there's a time when they need to read something to themselves. and they don't want me to read it to them because they want to be able to learn how to do it themselves. If I'm constantly in their face, over their shoulder, micromanaging all of that process, they don't get to do any of those things independently, and that they're not gaining the skills that it takes to do that independently.
And again, we've talked about this in other episodes, but when reading is reduced down to a paragraph so that you can answer questions, right? The outcome being the test or the questions that you're answering, you've sucked every amount of joy out of that process.
Right.
The pieces that we love about reading are getting lost in a story and connecting and seeing ourselves in characters and seeing different worlds and people that we've never experienced before, getting the window, right? That's really where the magic happens in reading. And I feel like that's the piece. And then talking with people about it, right? How often did we hear kids talking about, the latest Harry Potter and how far are you? And they'd be in the lobby waiting for school to start, like showing how far they were in the book or what part they got to. And everybody's excited. I can't wait for you to read the next chapter. Like, that is the magic of reading. It's not so that you can answer damn questions on a piece of paper afterwards. It's like you want to be able to get lost in a story and then connect with other people around that story. It's the same reason we love going to see movies, right? It's not about, being able to answer a question when you come out of the theater. It's that we got lost in a world together and now we've, seen the world differently and we can connect about it. That's the magic. And we've stripped all that joy out of so many content areas because we're looking only at, can we get a number to move? Can we get the data point to move? And it's like, gosh, we're starting in all the wrong places.
Well, and again, if we use reading as the example, humans have been storytellers for as long as they could speak. There are so many cultural reasons to be storytellers and to want to hear stories. Some of them that helps us understand who we are together. Some of it is that it's interesting and it's fun. Others, it helps keep us safe. I mean, there's so many different reasons that we've done storytelling. Yeah. So why have we, again, like you said, reduced it down to, you're going to learn how to read this, something that used to be something you only listened to back in, your ancestors' time. And now we're going to force you to read this in a way that we're telling you how to do it. There are so many constraints on what you can and cannot do that, again, we've taken that joy out of that. So how do we put, again, I think I know how to put the joy back into the reading. I've done that with kids.
And I think that we try to scapegoat a lot of what's just happening in society. Yeah. So we'll scapegoat and say, well, it's the TikTok generation and they're always watching videos and they're always doing, okay, but why are they doing that? Because it's still connecting them to, like you're saying, that story. Like, there's still something there. I don't think it's that they aren't interested in reading. I think that they don't see reading as getting lost in a story and exploring something and experiencing something. And then we wrap anxiety around it and stress and pressure that is totally unnatural. And now it's not only do I not look forward to reading, it creates in me a feeling to actively, it sets off my fight or flight to avoid it because you've put so much anxiety around it. Yeah,
kids are so much more intuitive, and they not only do they know when the adults around them are stressed. So I'm not saying adults don't be stressed, but what I'm saying is every time we raise the stakes of something, so whether it's math scores or any kind of scores that we're doing on standardized tests, and we make those so important, the kids, first of all, know it's baloney. They do. They know in the grand scheme someday that it's not going to really matter, but that all of a sudden now they're experiencing something where someone is telling them that it does matter. And now that's at war with how they experience this. So now okay,
or
well, what
they're
if I'm wrong?
So convinced they've believed the message so much that it does matter that any amount of failure or I'm not getting it is catastrophic, because it's not just I'm not getting it right now. It's and all the adults seem to believe there's something wrong with me and I'll never get there.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we talked about the student who was like, I was the dumb kid. And that was the message she got because of the anxiety of leaving the classroom every day for a remedial program and the focus, I mean, that comes with like a shift of attention of everybody's noticing I'm leaving. That again, social anxiety plays in, but also every day now she's being told you're not good enough to sit in the classroom with all of the other peers. We have to remove you and like really focus in on this thing. And I think it's the best of intentions, right? We want to shore up those skills. We want to support those kids. I think that the ways that we've set up those systems and the focus and the attention that we give it, we have to be really mindful about how that looks. And again, we had those kids at Anastasis. We did not have remedial programs. We just didn't have, that wasn't part of how we were set up.
Right.
We saw these kids. The first thing that happened was they realized that learning looked different. Learning had joy. It was playful. It was fun. It was okay to take risks. It was okay to make mistakes. We were there with them, all of those things. I think secondarily, we worked really hard at naming the emotions that were coming up and that we were seeing in kids and helping them, is your heart racing right now? What does it feel like? Just talking through so that they could name what was happening, because sometimes they would say things like, I'm depressed. And then as we talked with them, what we discovered is actually I'm embarrassed. Right. And that's creating a sense of distance from my classmates, which feels like sadness and depression to me. But really the source of it was embarrassment. So once we could kind of pull apart those things, when we could say, yeah, when I'm doing, when a teacher calls on me, I used this all the time. I feel like the cartoon characters running all around and like bumping into each other. That's what's happening in my brain. And my heart gets going and my breath gets shallow. And even if I know the answer, it's like everything is gone in that instance. And the kids are like, yeah, that happens to me too. Or, they have their own experience and their own stories. And then once they hear, we would do those kind of lessons in metanoia. And then once they're hearing from their peers that they're not the only ones with that experience, they're hearing from the adults, no, that's a common experience. And here are ways that help me to take a deep breath or ask for a minute or, can you come back to me? Like just giving them some strategies too, that suddenly changes everything where they can embrace the joy and just like fall into the learning.
Well, even giving them vocabulary, helping them with vocabulary, because, kids often will say, I'm happy, I'm sad, or I'm mad, or something like that. And giving them different degrees of those things, feeling content, like even knowing what content means versus happy.
Yeah.
But giving them different words that weren't exact synonyms, because sometimes, happy is maybe not where I'm at, but I'm okay.
Right.
I'm at peace, that we gave them different kinds of adjectives to be able to look at, to watch like facial expressions of people who said that they were feeling that emotion at the time. And then being able to say, it's okay. We don't expect you to be happy at 24/7. That's not a human being. And we loved using the Inside Out. I know we've talked about that in previous episodes too, where that movie helped kids understand that a balance of emotions is what makes us human. And if we only try to be happy all the time, it actually steals from our joy and keeps us kind of hanging out in sadness all the time.
And that we can have conflicting emotions in the the
same
time, right? I mean, how many times did we hear kids say, I'm a little bit disappointed, but I'm also excited. Right. So they could be experiencing both of those things at the same time, and to really be able to think about that. And we tied that back into reading. As we were reading things, we would stop and talk about what kind of emotion the character might be experiencing based on the circumstances, and when have we felt that emotion. So it became this, like I said, it wasn't a bolt-on SEL curriculum. It was really like, how do we embed this in everything that we're doing and talking about so that kids see that it's part of the whole human experience.
We were able to do that in music and art, but also in science and math. And when we would, especially when we combined those things, which again, that's how we did
in inquiry, that's
school,
how we did
right?
It. Yep.
But you could be looking at the math of patterns in nature and in talking about how fractals work and what that means. But then we could also go look at a tree in wintertime and not only think about it mathematically, scientifically, how did it grow that way, but also like, look how beautiful it is. And the kids can really kind of marvel that, right?
That. Yeah.
And that's, again, if you break it down to its barest components, fractals are not interesting. If you look at it with awe, right? And then
you're right.
Even as the adult to say, isn't it a kind of a cool thing that this is how things grow? Where else might we see this? And then having them think through, I mean, again, we've just done science and math and art and talking about emotions and how it's okay, like how we feel when we look at things that we find pleasing or beautiful. So those things.
Even in that example, I'm remembering one of the kids had drawn the tree with the fractals and they're like, it kind of looks like lungs. And isn't that interesting? Because that's why we can breathe. That it enables us to be able to breathe, but it's this reciprocal relationship. And it was like brilliant, right?
I will tell you, I know I've told you this many times before, I would have had a really hard time ever going back and teaching in a traditional model, because not only was it, incredible for me to experience as a teacher, but just watching kids learn how joyful the world is around them, and even seeing really hard things and hard problems that we're like, okay, this is something we're going to have to figure out how to solve someday. But even looking at it from that approach, it's when you find joy in learning, it does something to your soul also. It helps, there's that independence we talked about before. There's the, I can do this.
Yeah.
I know that there's struggle, and struggle means my brain is learning. All of those things that we really did help kids to take in as they were realizing, yes, this might be challenging, but I can do this, especially with help from someone else.
And I think about how soul sucking it is even for teachers to be so focused on the data and moving the numbers and increasing scores and that being the full focus, and the pressure that, we got from administrators and from the district and from the country at large and all of these things, right? That's an enormous amount of pressure that takes the joy out of it for teachers as well. It's not just the kids who get impacted by that. And yeah, you're right. Every day it was like, we're all here celebrating that, one, we get to be here doing this together. We're learning together. We're figuring things out. We're, doing it side by side. And there is joy in all of that on both sides for teachers and for students. And I think that then that reciprocal relationship of when the teachers are finding joy, the adults in the space are joyful and excited about it, well, then it's that's gonna keep filtering through in the same way that anxiety can filter through in a more traditional kind of structure where there is so much pressure on every moment being, exactly right.
That reminds me too, like when we think about struggle and where we're coming from and what kind of baggage that we bring in with us, we didn't just approach the social and emotional learning of the students. We also did it together as staff.
We did.
I remember a specific example. We were all sitting in the office one day, and one of the teachers was saying, I'm supposed to be teaching how you can have positive and negative exponents, but I don't even get it. And that teacher was like, I know I learned this and I know what I'm supposed to do. I know the algorithm, but I don't know why. And when kids ask me why, I'm really struggling. And I could feel all of the tension in that room because, again, some people in that room had really had a bad experience in some kind of math instruction, right? Done to them. And so we, and again, we've talked about this before, where a lot of people have just said, oh yeah, I'm just bad at math. And I remember having the discussion, okay, so we had a big whiteboard cabinet that we could write on. And I went over and I kind of just did a few little activities on and said, here's how I see it. Like the feeling was palpable at the beginning of how tense it was, but you could
Mhm.
even see people's shoulders relax after we talked through it as a group of people. There wasn't like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you don't know this. That pressure wasn't there. Or
Right.
didn't you learn this in school? What's wrong with you? That it was, how can we help each other feel better about this and understand?
And even the freedom, I'm thinking back in my experiences in other schools, I would have never owned up to something like that in a group of peers.
Right.
Because the focus is you have to be the best at all. Like there's not room for that, where we really had permission. I think even that is huge, that a teacher felt comfortable enough to say, I'm struggling with this.
Right.
And we often even named like, I'm showing up real anxious today and I don't even know why, but that we knew that about each other and could help each other through that we could feel okay naming it together. And again, all of it makes you feel less isolated, less alone. You feel this sense of belonging. You feel like all of these other pieces are part of that. And what we know about the brain is if we don't feel safety, if we don't feel connection and belonging, getting to that learning piece is going to be really, really hard. And we said it last week, but I think it's so detrimental that we only look at outcomes as the academic piece, and we're not asking the right questions about what all is part of this. And like I said, we scapegoat things too easily, and then that lets us off the hook for really understanding the complexity of what it is.
Right. You are mentioning like we would talk about how we were coming into the day and as staff, but also we did that with kids and helping kids to know, oh, you've got a really major life event going on. That's something for your family that you're really going through that, and giving them space to acknowledge that, oh, this is hard. It's hard for the adults. It's hard for us. And to know that we recognize that and we understood, or if they just wanted to come and offload, this is what's happening, between my friends, or I had, my grandma died or anything like that.
I was going to say, how many times did they come in from recess and they're like, we have an unresolved disagreement on the playground. They're not ready to learn math right now. They're not ready to engage their thinking minds until we've walked through that and helped get to the point where that relationship is restored, or at least restored enough that we can do the next thing, right? Even sometimes that was, we have this going on right now. In 30 minutes, you're going to, right before lunch, why don't you stop down and talk with Mrs. Tankley and Mrs. K, and we'll walk you through that. Even knowing that it wasn't going to be left undone allowed them to re-engage what was happening. And I don't think we do that in most schools.
I will say this. There are adults who are unable to compartmentalize the troubles that are happening in their lives. And we know that affects whatever they're doing, whether it's working, whether they're on vacation, anything, right?
Yep.
If a mature brain cannot make that happen, why are we expecting a child's developing brain to be able to do that? Because it's not possible. And if you want that child to be able to come back to your classroom and do their best work, then you have to address the issue that is forefront in their brain right now. I don't understand how we can possibly look at a child and say, you know what, suck it up. We don't have time for that right now. Because what you've just told that kid is what's important to you doesn't matter to the rest of us. So just do what we tell you to do because we tell you to do it. And you've lost that kid for that time or that day, or maybe for the rest of the school year by doing so and ignoring the things that are really important to us. Telling a child who's had a mishap, made a mistake, had an issue with another student that it's not a big deal is really dismissive. And again, you're eroding the trust if you even had it to begin with. You're eroding the trust that kid has in any of the adults around them, because you've just said something that is huge to them doesn't really matter. You are not providing perspective for that kid. What you're saying is what you think is important doesn't matter to me, so therefore it's not important.
Or what you're experiencing in your body is not really happening.
Right.
I mean, how many times, as an anxious person, you hear people say, well, everything's fine. It's okay. And you're like, it's not fine inside my body right now. Like my body is telling me something is really wrong. And you're telling me it's all fine. It's okay. Rather than helping me name and acknowledge what's happening, saying, yeah, and sometimes we don't know why we're anxious, and let's explore that together. Let's think about what triggers might be there. Even just acknowledging that what I'm saying is I'm experiencing is real is huge to kids. Because now we're not asking them to have this like unhealthy cognitive dissonance within themselves of my body is telling me something, but everybody around me is telling me something different. Simply by acknowledging that, you're releasing the associated shame. You're saying, we see you, that it's, you're not the only one who experiences it. Like all of those things, I think really that alone, I think, let the shoulders drop for our students, let them take deep breaths. They knew that they could trust us with that information. Sometimes they told us things that were like, oh, you really trust us. Sometimes we got those moments of like, oh, okay, we are on a real trusting basis. But
maybe a lot of adults don't know how incredibly taxing cognitive dissonance is. I can't talk today. Cognitive dissonance is on the body. When you feel one thing and your brain is registering that, but you're being told something exactly opposite, and you can call it whatever you want, but that does have a toll on your body. There are lots of books written, I'm thinking of like The Body Keeps a Score, for example. That does some real damage, and it can affect health, physical health, not just mental health, but physical health.
Yeah.
And that
how
obviously,
the brain is functioning.
I mean, it's really interesting how we don't really talk about that more, maybe, especially as it pertains to education. So if you're telling a child one thing and they're experiencing something completely different or entirely opposite, that's going to affect how that kid learns. And it really does a disservice to everything that we say that we're about in teaching and learning if we aren't paying attention to those things. So again, when we look at social emotional learning, part of it is, do I know this student well enough to see how they're entering the room or the building? Do I know them well enough to, when they say they need help, it isn't just a cry for attention? And again, how many times do we just say, oh, they just want attention? Well,
right.
Generally speaking,
there's a reason for
there's
that.
There's usually a reason.
Even if that's true, there's a reason for that.
There's some unmet need for that kid who's always wanting attention. How I give that child attention to help them be more independent and to be more aware of themselves might change depending on how I know that kid. Right?
Yeah.
So, but again, if there's an unmet need.
Well, and helping them figure out that what dysregulates me is going to be different than what dysregulates somebody else. So understanding that cause effect piece is huge. Helping them kind of start to make those discoveries about themselves is huge. I mean, that was big. That was big for me. And I learned it in the process of starting a school. Like a lot of my anxiety and all of those pieces, really, it was amplified by starting a school, but there was a lot of work done by starting a school of understanding it in myself by helping the kids understand it. And then to know that the strategies that work to calm me down are not the strategies that might calm you down. And so it's really that two-pronged approach of that discovery, again, self-inquiry that we were doing. And I think in the larger, just how we were learning through inquiry, it made sense that was part of how we were exploring emotion and the impacts that it had on everything else.
Well, and then even how it goes from interpersonal and intrapersonal. So I'm learning a whole lot about myself, but I'm also learning about how my classmates react to certain things too. So now I'm not only learning more about how things affect me and how that affects my learning. But I can also see the stimuli in the classroom as how it affects other kids. And we had a conversation in one of my classrooms that I have a hard time with very repetitive sounds, which is hilarious because music I'm fine with.
Yes.
Right? I mean, there's so much repetition in music, but if it's
clicking pens,
clicking
water bottles,
or beeping sounds, especially, very much dysregulate me. And it's hard for me to focus if that's happening. And then, so I would divulge that to the kids, and then they would, if they chose, to share something that was really hard for them. And so instead of having a quiet time when somebody's clicking their pen and someone yells, "Stop it!" like we had happen in the past, we could talk about, say, "Oh, could you please stop? Because that's really hurting how I'm trying to read," or whatever it might be. And then we find out, I didn't even realize I was clicking the pen. So sorry about that, right? They started to really take in more about how they were in the world just in their little classrooms.
What I loved is when we had those conversations so freely during Metanoia, everybody in the building knew, like, if you're crunching around Mrs. Tankley, it's going to make her insane, right?
Right.
Everybody knew that, but it created this sense of empathy where, you know, they would, I'm going to stand over here so I don't bother you with, like, they were very cognizant of that in such a sweet way. But like you're saying, they also started seeing that about each other, not just in their own class. We would have kids come we had a buzzing light that really impacted kiddo with misophonia, and she, you know, would go and turn it off often. But what was so cool is the other kids became aware and would see her coming up the stairs and like preemptively set the room up so that it would be comfortable. That compassion, the empathy, the understanding, the awareness, I think was huge, of just thinking outside of themselves, but also understanding themselves more clearly.
Setting kids up to learn about compassion for themselves and compassion for others. I've heard a lot of arguments against that. Oh, that's making them soft. And, you know, that's not how they're going to survive in the world. I'm like, no, I disagree, because they're going to go out and ensure that people feel welcome and feel safe and feel trusted and trustworthy. All of those things are important in a community, in a workspace, in a family.
And they're not gonna leap to conclusions about how somebody is interpreting things, because they're going to be more aware of, there's probably more to the story than I know. And we did that through watching videos and talking about, you know, clips from Inside Out, but also there were commercials that we watched every year that were, I can't remember, insurance from India. That commercial is such a good one, that you think one thing is happening and then you understand that there's a bigger context, and the kids would watch that and just we'd have such great conversations.
Where they water the plant, right?
They water the plant.
Yeah.
I'll have to see if I can find it. If I can, I'll link to it in the show notes. But I just loved that we could have those discussions. It didn't have to be a prepackaged thing. A lot of it happened organically and naturally as we were experiencing life together, where we could say, I'm noticing that this is happening, or that a lot of us see this energy feels off. And we could just talk about it and do it in real time, not because it was like the next lesson in our SEL curriculum. And I think that also made it stickier for kids, because it was happening in context, the same way that we want all learning to happen. Like, it's better in context, right? And so having that piece be in context, but all of that kind of groundwork is what made the learning able to be joyful too. And I think sometimes we think, well, we'll just gamify the learning and then it'll be fun. And that can be true. But maybe. I think to your point, learning is joyful. And when we have the correct underlying, underpinning circumstances, then kids get to experience that joy in an authentic way, not because we're trying to manufacture something that's fun.
Testing pep rally. Right? The kids know, they're just like, give us our treats or whatever's going to happen.
Here's a Nerf war as a result of your good scores on your tests, you know, based on a true story.
Right. I think there are a couple of things here. Most humans want to be heard and understood.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's a form of love that we give to it. And I wish that, again, I've told students this many times, that I wish that the English language really had more than one term for love, because, we talk about different, if you say love, sometimes, kids will start giggling because they think it's all about romantic love.
Romantic love. Yeah.
I mean, if I see you, I see who you are, I respect you, I care about you, that kind of love for each other, for my fellow human beings, right? If I see you and I hear you and I don't just assume something about you on the surface level, like, again, we want to be heard and we want to be understood. So if I want to create a learning space to help prepare kids for, I'm not going to say the real world because I really hate that, but for what they're going to move on to next, I have to really care more about where they are right now than where they're going.
Yes.
Even though I want them to be able to go where they're going, I can't just move. It's like skipping a step, right? I have to know where they are right now, hear them, see them, respect them for where they are, and then help them to learn the tools to move on.
That's such a good point. We're so future focused.
Oh, yes.
And we're not ever rooted in the present. And I think we don't teach kids also how to be here in the present.
Right.
And I know we read a lot of the same like spiritual books of just, here is the only place we ever can be. It's the only place we've ever been, and it's the only place we ever can be is here. But so much of the anxiety comes because we're so focused on where we're not.
Right.
And so it's this constant deficit that you're trying to make up for because you're never there in the future. You're only ever here. The brain is trying to figure out all the moves that are going to get you there. Yeah, that's going to create anxiety.
Right. Well, if you stop and think about most anxiety, it is about what's going to happen next or what's coming, right? Not necessarily about what's happening right this minute. You know, all those grounding exercises, put your feet on the ground and feel the physical response of your body. Where are you right now?
What can you see? What can you hear?
Yes, get your five senses. I'll go read a poem, or I'll draw something or read something to help me reground myself, because when I am anxious, it is always about what's going to happen. It is not about what's happening right now. And again, if I want kids' brains to be focused, I mean, if this were for purely selfish reasons, if I wanted my students to perform at their best in my classroom, I would need to meet their needs first. And then, and that could be food. It could be, I mean, it's so many different things, right?
And when you're grounded in the here and now, when you're present to what is happening, that's when you can respond to what is happening, which is going to impact the future. That's the only thing that can impact the future. And so instead of forcing kids to, just do more math problems, or just you're not applying yourself enough, to actually be present enough to say, are your base needs met? Do you feel safe? Do you feel a sense of belonging? Are you fed? Are you tired?
Are you safe?
Once we can, are you safe? Once you can have those present taken care of, the future can be impacted differently. I think we just we're not good at understanding our present circumstances enough to understand how much those realities really do impact all of what happens in the future outcomes.
I had a teacher when I was in the role of parent, and this teacher told me that her job was to prepare my child for middle school. And I was like, great, but you got a whole year where she's still in elementary school. So if you're always looking to middle school, what happens to, hey, this is our last year of elementary school, and these are the fun times that we've had here, and what kind of things am I learning because I'm in this school right now? Well, you have to be able to write a 5-paragraph essay by the time you're in 6th grade, and it's all of these silly things, right?
It's not compelling to always be learning something for a future self that you don't know yet.
Right.
That's not a compelling
No.
narrative.
And again, for a teacher, an adult human being who is, we're going to assume somewhere 25 or older, the way that you experience time compared to a child who is 10 is significantly different when you think relatively. A year for you is a pretty quick time, but for a 10-year-old, a year is forever. And you've now just taken and uprooted that child's understanding of what was going to happen this year, and you put it all in middle school. And that was hard for my kid, right?
I mean, to your point of the joy of learning, if I'm always focused on some future benefit that I might get, right? How many times do we see, or a lifetime from now, how many times did you go to a teacher and say, why are we learning this? Why do I need to know this? And it's, well, your adult self will thank you that you've learned this in 5th grade. And they have no concept of that. They can't help to have any sort of concept for that. It's too big, right? I mean, even us, like as adults, why aren't we better at saving? It's because it's really, really hard to think that far in the future and take care of that future self. And so when you can say to a student, we're learning this because isn't it interesting?
Right. Or this is something that is interesting and fun, but also it's a really cool process in your brain that happens when you start thinking about all of these different things and how they connect to each other. And yeah, you might not need to know this one fact or this one skill when you're 32, but right now, look at all of the cool things that we can do with it once we learn how to do it. And that to me is a much more interesting and compelling answer than, oh, you're going to need it someday when you're doing your taxes. Because again, that might as well be
no concept.
That might as well be, telling kids they're going to meet Bigfoot someday. There's probably, it might never happen.
That feels more likely to probably a lot of kids than needing whatever algebraic function they're learning this week.
Side note, the number of our children who used to say that they were going to go squatching on the weekends.
Yes.
Do you remember that? Oh my gosh. Yes. So funny.
So funny. But again, that's part of what I love so much about the inquiry process too, is inquiry is interesting because it's rooted in now. It's rooted in discovery and exploration of what's happening and what you're discovering and what connections are coming up. And it's meaningful as it's happening. And it's not, as we're doing it, we're not talking about, well, someday you'll use this skill. It's like we're using it right now for the things that we're exploring and doing and interested in. And so it always had that, again, context in the present.
I think that there's something to be said too.
I'm really excited about this present. It's just a connection that has been made in my mind. And I'm like, that's why inquiry's so good.
And I think too, when you meet people where they are in the present and you acknowledge and you see them, then it gives them this feeling of, well, I can look backwards into the past and say, okay, what did I learn before that helps me now? And what might this do for me in the future? But if you're constantly skipping that present, it's
what connections might it have in the future, I think is probably how kids
and it's too abstract.
Kids would think about it.
When we really think again about the developing brain and the capacity for abstract thinking, we spend way too much time there. It's like the metaphors are just like crazy right now in my head. But when we talk about grounding yourself, you're doing something that's very concrete and tangible. And that is something that a developing brain needs a lot of. So if you're constantly working in the future and with abstract concepts, you're doing something that they can't touch and they can't make context or sense of because they haven't been rooted enough in the present yet. Again, they're young. They're babies.
And what we know, because we can look back historically over our time, is the joy is there. The experiences are happening. They are rooted in the present. That did impact what happened in the future and how they saw themselves as learners and how they approached learning, after they left Anastasis in high school and all of these things. They were empowered in a different way. And so we got the benefit of seeing how it impacted them in the present, but also what it did look like for their future, which is now the past. But that whole idea of like, I think our fear as adults and why we go straight to outcomes is because it feels really easy to measure. But I can't remember. I'm going to I can't remember where this quote came from, but measuring the wrong thing is worse than not measuring anything at all. And I think we've got all the wrong metrics right now. We're focused in all the wrong places. And it is worse than having no metric at all, because we're so hyper focused on that metric that we're missing out on what is creating that metric, like the fullness of what creates that metric. And we're assuming that that one little tiny piece of the story is the story, the whole story. And it's not. It's this minuscule piece of a bigger picture. It is pointing to something is wrong, but we're not looking at really we're not understanding what all is wrong that's creating that outcome. We're hyper focused on one piece of that story. We double down on that one piece, and then we're shocked when it keeps going more wrong. And it's like,
yeah. I grew up in Nebraska, so I was around a lot. I lived in Omaha, so I wasn't around a lot of farmers, but I had relatives, and then we would go visit them on their farms. And they often would talk about how, like, use this as an analogy, where if you have a pig that you want to get to a certain weight, and all you do is weigh that pig, but you forget to feed the pig, and you forget to provide an area where they can, run around and do their pig things, right? That weighing that pig every day isn't going to make a difference. Making sure that the pig is cared for with food and the environment, then you probably are going to get that pig to your goal.
Okay, this reminds me of Tusha,
Mm-hmm.
which is a spiritual teacher here in Denver that during our cultural pilgrimage with our oldest students, we met Tusha and had a lovely relationship over the years. But this just shows, again, how often these messages were happening with the kids from lots of different voices. And Tusha, when we visited him one year, was talking about, I think it's a Hindu parable, and he was talking about how he said, imagine, a very wealthy person gets this beautiful bird, and it's the most beautiful bird they've ever seen. And they put all their focus and time and attention into making this golden gilded cage and decorating and making sure and putting rubies and gems and diamonds. And it's the most beautiful cage that has this beautiful bird. And they spend all their time and money really focusing on the exterior, the outside, and how it's looking. And then they're shocked when the bird dies because it's not been fed and taken care of.
And it's stuck in a cage.
It's stuck in a cage, right? And so, yeah, that same idea of, if we're going to focus on something, we have to focus on all of its parts and pieces. And because we're talking about humans, that's complex.
Well, even to go further into that metaphor, that bird didn't need a gold cage, nor did it need all the rubies and the jewels. It needed some food and water and maybe some freedom to fly around, right? Yeah. So a lot of times the things that we think, I like that your metaphor was much prettier than my pig one.
It wasn't mine. It was Tusha's, but I will co-opt it.
But it's just another example, though, of how many times we think we're doing, here's what you need, right? Mm-hmm. And then we're shocked when the kids aren't flourishing because we've been the ones making the decisions entirely about what it is that they need without giving them any voice or even to see if their basic needs are met. Again, we keep going back to, if you're growing up in poverty, if you don't have enough food or someplace to live, if you are moving around to different houses or don't have a home, if you're experiencing
have big T or small T trauma.
Yes. Are you experiencing racism? Are you experiencing bullying? All of these things add up to a child who is not necessarily going to be able to learn to their full potential because basic needs aren't being met. And we're like, but no, you need to have more math instruction. So we're going to send you to another class and take you out of art and music so you can do that. We are prescribing the wrong things and trying to solve a problem that isn't that kid's problem.
Well, and I think about the pressure that teachers feel in all of these places where they're also getting all of the pressure to focus on the wrong things. Mm-hmm. And then not only that, but we're paying for professional development for them to focus more on it, right? Rather than because I do think that teachers are a special breed. And I do think that the majority of us get into education because we see the humanity, the complexity of
Agreed.
Of all of it. And because we do have compassion and we do have empathy, and, how many teachers do we know that that have been part of Anastasis along the way, that either I got into education because I was the kid that it didn't work for and I wanted it to be better, or I saw the cracks in how this wasn't working for everyone, or just I wanted to make sure kids knew that there was somebody that cared about them in their lives, right? So I do think that educators are a special breed in that way. But then we're getting a lot of pressure from these external sources to focus so heavily on one piece. And yeah, it takes the joy out for us as well.
Well, you want to speak about cognitive dissonance right there. We know this isn't really the right thing to do, but we're forced to do it if we're in a traditional system that doesn't give us any autonomy or agency. And then we wonder why teachers are sick a lot. And I do remember when I was working in professional development, and just that's when a lot of studies about the health of classroom teachers, this is, years before COVID, and how interesting it was. If the first thing was, well, put the blame on the kids. Kids are these cesspools of germs and they're always bringing it in and it's attacking the immunity systems of teachers.
Which could be true. That could be true. That is true.
But also,
yeah,
just like we do with the children, sometimes as an adult, you can't use the facilities. And when you have human needs, you have to go at a certain schedule. So we have regimented a daily schedule that doesn't work for humans. And
then we wonder why the kidney infections come along and you're like, oh.
Right. Or we have, a teacher shortage because not only are some of them fed up with it and they don't want to do it because of that cognitive dissonance, some of them, their health has prevented them from continuing in a classroom capacity. And then they may try to, work in administration somewhere, or they might just leave altogether. And then we look back and think, well, we're just not getting good enough teachers. We got to strike back and say, no, that's
absolutely
not the case.
The first year that I taught, I left that year thinking I was never going to teach again. And I was losing hair. I looked like I was going through chemo from the stress of just not being able to leave the real problems I was seeing in my classroom emotionally. And I knew that some of them were not safe going home, and I had no control over that. That was really hard. I mean, there's even just those pieces of teachers are an empathetic group often, and we carry our students' stories with us beyond the classroom. And that also has impacts on health and wellness. So, and you and I have both been in circumstances beyond the one I just described where health played a part in us stepping away for a little bit, because it just is the reality of the system that we've built that. Yeah.
It's interesting to me that we've built this system and we feel like we are so locked into it that we are willing to have casualties, for lack of a better term, because of this system. We know that it doesn't work for all kids. In fact, it specifically doesn't work for all kids. And we know that, and yet we still allow it to continue, knowing that it's not the best system that we could be doing. So we keep doubling down on, well, this is how we do it, rather than let's just stop for a second and say, what can we do better?
And then blaming the system.
Yes.
Right.
Or the teachers, or the kids, or the families. And if we just take a step back and say, none of that is working the way that we really want it to, and we're doing a lot of damage emotionally, physically, academically to not just the children, but also to the adults involved. Why do we continue doing it? Part of it is is this system a situation like the banks that we had that were too big to fail? I don't think so. You obviously didn't think so because you started this school.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's interesting. I reminded of that illustration that our friend Wes Roberts used. Wes is a kind of whole life mentor for adults, and he uses this metaphor of, it's not just a metaphor, it's also true. Circuses used to chain up baby elephants, and stake them to the ground so that they would learn not to wander. And so they spent years with, these short 4-foot chains, and they learned not to wander because they couldn't. What was interesting is even when those chains were removed and they were no longer shackled, they wouldn't stray more than 4 feet away from where they were left because they still believed that they were shackled. And I think about how much in education we keep telling the story that we're shackled And I think in a lot of cases, those have been removed, sometimes through policy, sometimes just we're still telling old stories that we're more confined than maybe we really are. And I know that there are very real things that a lot of teachers are experiencing, that because my admin says this is the way, that there isn't as much certainly as much flexibility as we had. And I also think that there probably is more freedom in areas than we're taking advantage of.
I also think that we forget of our collective power of if it's a hassle, I'm just not going to deal with it. Right. But if you collectively, not individually, collectively reach out to your lawmakers in your state, for example, or even start at the local level and say, you know what, the loudest voices that are screaming about how kids are failures and all this, they're not telling the whole story, nor are they telling the truth. We need to ignore the small groups, very small groups who just happen to be loud and who also inflict the most pain, and collectively go to our school boards, go to our legislators and our governors and whoever else you want to talk to, say, this doesn't seem right. And I think we need to make a change, and have some examples of here are things that we can do. Parents have a whole lot more power than they know that they have. But
I agree.
I think, again, you can look at throughout history when collective action happened, you saw progress. And then, and again, the pattern is over and over and over throughout history. This is why we study history. But after a period of that's either peaceful or whatever you want to call it, there's some complacency. And people just do what's being done because that's just what happens. And then the power to change things seems like it's impossible. But it's not. It's just we've gotten to that point where we haven't. I mean, we were just talking the other day about how many times in your lifetime have you contacted anybody who works in the government for you? And for most adults, that answer is never. And I'm just like, the number of times that I've had to go speak in front of a school board before to say, no, you should not cut music out of your program, and here's why. Or here's what for any number of reasons. I've done that more than once. I've also contacted my state legislators and my governor and mayors and my senators and things like that. All of those people to say, this is something that I see as a problem. And I would like for you, my representative who works for me and my community, to make a change. If we really feel that it's important enough that kids learn in a space that looks different than it does right now, the only way that we're actually going to ever make that change is if enough people speak up. Otherwise, it's just business as usual. And when I look at going back to the whole topic here of social emotional learning, kids are not supposed to be in factories. They're small. They're not just tiny adults. They're small. Their bodies are not developed. Their brains are not fully developed. All of those things, they should not be in a factory-like system that treats them as if they are a product rather than another human being who has immense potentiality there. Potential, not potentiality.
Yeah. All of that has my mind kind of going in different directions, but
go off on a tangent there, but I really do think it's all connected.
I do think it is. And what it was making me think about was how much we have made the conversation and education like centered around those fringe conversations because we let the minority kind of dictate what we're talking about. And so we put so much emphasis on kind of this binary either or dichotomous relationship that in most schools is not true to the experience of the school. I was also thinking about how many people, when they're polled, say that education needs to change and it's terrible and it's awful. But then when you ask about, well, what was your experience in school, or what's your kids' experience at school? And they're like, well, I'm happy with my school, right? So I think that part of the disconnect is what you're talking about. We're kind of in these fringe conversations rather than collectively saying, what is really going on? What do we actually care about? What can we demand change around? Right. What could it look like if it was going the best way that it could? What do we hope for kids? What do we hope for ourselves as a society and as a country? I think if we maybe could get away from the either or kind of thinking that we're forced into in a lot of the media.
Right.
in the conversations around education, we may have more interesting and impactful conversations.
I think you're spot on, because if you ask a parent, and again, we ask our parents, families, this question: what do you want for your child? 1 out of 100 might say, oh, I want them to know their math facts. They usually say, I want my kids to be happy. They don't start off
and I don't want them to be limited in the opportunities they have, which sometimes comes back to, they need to be great at math or whatever.
Right.
But yeah.
They don't come in and say,
to be happy.
I want them to pass every test that comes up. I want them to understand the Pythagorean theorem. They don't say those things. Those things are great as academic skills. Absolutely. And I would say that they're important. But I'm going to come back and also say, if we want a community of people that we want to be a part of, I want those people to be healthy emotionally. I mean, I really, really do. I would take 100 emotionally stable people over a bunch of
people who, and honestly, people who are compassionate.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, if you've got those pieces, well, suddenly everything else is easier to handle. We can work together. We can continue learning together. We can do all kinds. Suddenly things become possible that are not possible when we are lacking in compassion and understanding of emotional intelligence.
Right. And again, there are quite a few people who might consider themselves old school and say, that's just a bunch of hippy dippy stuff. And, the warm fuzzies, that's not important. They need to learn how to be a productive member of society. I'm like, you cannot be a productive member of society if you are so stressed or you have so much anxiety that it's truly limiting what your brain can do. And that doesn't matter if you're a child or an adult.
Well, and I think about do I want the doctor who only knows their stuff, or do I want the doctor who knows their stuff and isn't compassionate? And frankly, I want the doctor who is not only knows their stuff, is compassionate. I want the doctor who still is learning.
Right.
Right? Still asking good questions, still doing the thing. But that's the same person I want running a school. That's the same person I want in a government position. That's the same person I want checking me out with groceries. You don't want a group of people. We don't want a community that just scores really well. That's not useful to any of us.
Well, and the emotional health of a community really thrives on people not just necessarily understanding, but making space for the diversity of thought and culture and all of those things. But if you stop and think, I always go back to Star Wars because, I have to. Yoda always says that fear leads to anger, right? There's anger and fear and hatred all in there, right? And those are all emotions that are definitely human things. But when we're acting out of fear or anger or hatred, it's usually because we have an unmet need. And what happens then is it's like that wounded animal metaphor where we're just striking out at everybody and everything because we're hurting. And in an emotionally safe place, we could help walk someone through that anger or fear or hatred. And again, I think it all comes down to fear, to be honest.
I do too. I think so, but sometimes we told the kids, anger is not a bad emotion.
It's
because
not.
Anger is information that something is not right.
Exactly.
In our community, in our world, and that can lead to action.
If you stay there, it's not emotionally healthy.
Right? And again, that anger into action comes with compassion, right? That is what makes that possible. We see the idea of righteous anger, right? Is that we're angry on behalf of and in service of.
Right.
And it's not just angry to be angry, but I think helping people kind of understand all of those components of what makes up. But I think you're right. A lot of times if it's personal fear, anger, it usually does come back to fear in my life. It usually does.
Well, and when you're in a state of fear all the time, it does corrupt a lot of your brain's processes. It makes you more suspicious and cautious in a way that isn't healthy for you.
It's not in service of something.
Right.
Yeah.
So just a metaphor is the person who won't leave their home because they're afraid that there's, somebody out to get them if they leave the house, right? That's not healthy. In all of these things, we can talk with kids about being afraid and how that's a normal thing, and we can help them walk through it, but we can also help them to see that if you stay in that fear space, that your body automatically goes into fight or flight, and that response is not a place that you can stay. There's no equilibrium there. Helping them to see that, because your brain stops learning when you're in fight or flight. You just do one of those two things. Yep. We've seen kids who have been in that position, and we know that.
And I would say fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Yes. I mean, even the fawn, you're not able to do the things because you're so focused on how do I keep this person from being all over, right? And I think how often in schools, they might not be in fight or flight or freeze, but we've seen a lot of kids who are in fawn and, oh yeah, I'll do anything to keep the balance, but they're not focused on the learning. They're focused on the fawning.
Yeah. All of that to say, when you're able to kind of talk through that with someone, again, with someone that you trust and that's been built, and you're able to speak to that, that's information that we as the adults in their lives need to know so that we can help them reassure that they're safe, reassure that they can talk to us about that. A lot of times it's just about, again, being heard. I am afraid that ... And when kids say that, you can kind of see after they've been able to talk about it, their shoulders relax, their bodies, they're instantly in a different place once they've had a chance to even just speak about it. It doesn't mean that they're better. And I did want to say that we are very careful at Anastasis not to cross the line of counseling. Mm-hmm. We are very careful to know, here are the things that we can talk about with kids. Here are the things that we can say to kids. And here's when we have to suggest that it goes to a professional.
And I will also say that we had the partnership and the relationship with families that a lot of times they would allow us to partner with a therapist or a counselor so that we could use similar tools, strategies, languages with that student. So even that piece of partnership was built in, that sometimes we had the words that were being used in that counseling, but we were not the ones necessarily creating that from,
And because that can be, a situation where you do want to step in and help, but also I'm not a fan of the stay in your lane comment all the time, even though I've said it to people. But I do know this is what I can be an ear. I can be a person who helps give you suggestions for things that have helped me. But again, if it's actual counseling or something that's more on the lines of therapy, that needs to be done by someone who is professional in that particular field.
Yes. And I will say, I always appreciated if there was known trauma.
Yes.
I always appreciated that families that would let us know about that so that we could partner and approach in ways that were sensitive to that trauma. Because sometimes that wasn't readily apparent, what was underlying some of those unmet needs or some of those things. And I think knowing source can be helpful for educators because we can approach it differently and with the appropriate lens and ask the right questions of, can we partner with the others that they're working with through that trauma so that we're not inadvertently creating new problems or exacerbating what's there.
Well, and I think that in bringing up the word trauma, even, 10 years ago, we used to talk about small T trauma and big T trauma. And since then, we have learned from experts in those fields that any trauma reacts, the brain reacts the same to whatever that perceived trauma is. And that putting a judgment from the adult perspective is actually super unhealthy for kids. And it goes back to, again, what we said earlier in the episode about I experienced, and this is how I'm feeling about it, or this is how unknowingly their brain is reacting to it.
Yeah, when I'm in a panic attack, it doesn't matter what triggered it.
Right. It doesn't matter if you think it's traumatic or not.
Difference. Yes, it makes no difference because the reaction that my body is having, oversized or not, is still happening.
Right.
So in a lot of those cases, it's like it almost doesn't matter. What matters is that you are experiencing whatever that looks like for you, right? Or however it's playing out.
Exactly.
is a real experience.
And what we have learned, again, is how that really can impact the brain in numerous ways, specifically cognitive processes, and it can sever connections that were already there, or it can prevent connections from being made entirely. So again, you're trying to ask a child to learn something, but because of previous trauma, that's not, it's again, not to say that they can't ever learn it. It's just, you need to address the issue first before you just, pound those math facts harder because they have to learn them. That's ignoring that what their actual needs are.
It strikes me that you and I, well, all of us at Anastasis, it feels so natural that this is the language we use. And I almost feel like it's always been in our psyche. I know that is not true because you're right. We learned it along the way and together. I mean, I even named that at the beginning that like I started a school. We learned all of this in real time because we were responding to the real kids that we had and the real things. We brought in specialists to better understand what was happening. We had these discussions. We read, we did all the things. It always strikes me because it feels so obvious now how many folks would come into our school for Five Sigma is a good example. And you'd hear a lot of the adages that I feel like we grew up with of, like you were saying, well, this is soft, or they need to, like, the real world's going to kick them in the butt. So they need to know how to deal with that, or all of these things that I think have been so part of just the growing up in the times that we grew up in, where it's like, well, suck it up and, do whatever. Or, I have parents that grew up in the 50s and 60s and that whole narrative, was you got to toughen up and you get a thicker skin, and those kind of things I think are so part of what has been in the air in our culture that it can be hard to look at when you're first considering what the implications of that are. But again, from this side of things now, I'm like, it's so obvious, but we've seen the real change that happens with kids and with us when all of this is true. And so it's like, it's hard now that you see it, you can't unsee it.
Right. Yeah.
And so hearing from people that they just need a thicker skin, I'm like, who does that help? How is that helpful?
Well, you'd mentioned earlier that the news report about the reading scores are lower again, and they are blaming COVID. And I hear so many people,
social media.
Yes. I hear so much about learning loss associated with the time around COVID. And I'm like, okay, yes, a lot of kids did not have day-to-day interactions with teachers. However, collectively, we experienced one of the most traumatic things in our history that adults are still trying to recover from that. And I'm not even talking about the physical health part of it. I just mean the mental and social part of it.
Yeah.
We did not get to see our families and friends. Some of us lost family members and friends that we couldn't go see or even go to a funeral because of a virus that was running rampant. All of those things are collective trauma that we didn't address.
And the fear that was in the air for years that's going to impact all of us. Yeah. It goes back to when we're focused on the wrong metric and we're not focused on we're not asking enough of the right questions about what is the full story here, and thinking about, I keep saying it, but it is complex, like the complexity of a pandemic and how that impacts people and how that impacts other systems and how that impacts, even think about how I had a husband that went and did a job outside of the home every single day since we've been married, and suddenly no longer had a job that required him to leave the home. And just that shift in dynamics, how many families experience that shift? It's not necessarily a bad shift, but the bright lines between work and home are not so bright anymore. Right. And that's going to shift the family dynamics and the way it feels at home and what's happening and the conversations you're overhearing. Like, all of it matters. And I think we try to look at one thing and say, this is the thing that matters. And again, when we scapegoat it with it's COVID without really pulling apart what that means. And I realize that there are researchers who are doing that work to pull it apart. I think unfortunately, what gets reported is the soundbite.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not helpful for us as a society to just get the soundbite version.
We have become a society over, decades that ignores the complex and goes for the simple. I want the panacea. I want something that, oh, that's the issue. Okay, let's solve that problem. Move on. And again, we're back into thinking about the future rather than here's where we really are and what can we do to look at the complexity and try to solve some of those issues. A lot of it's, we are, I think, intentionally kept in a state of constant shock and,
fear.
I mean, yes, to a degree, because that's what sells, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what the top articles are on any news site or the biggest font on and printed media, it's usually the ones that are the most attention grabbing. And those are the ones that appeal to the darker side of our nature, not necessarily, you don't see the happy stories all the time. But I also don't think, you and I have talked about this privately before, but I don't think that our human brains are meant to be able to comprehend things on a global scale. And I mean, the constant, there's, people suffering in this country and this is what's happening over in this continent. And
it's too much for us to care about all of those things.
Right.
And because they're all presented to us from an equal billing standpoint,
right.
Then it makes it really hard to know, like, how can I care? We don't have the capacity to care as much, and they deserve that care.
Absolutely.
But it's too much for any of us to really process and respond to.
Yes. And it puts us in a functional freeze because when you are completely overwhelmed, your body just like, I can't, I have to stop. It's the, I can't even, right? That's that meme that goes around, but it's true. So one of the things that we used to do with kids, whenever there was a whole lot of awful in the news, and a lot of people would say, oh, look at Mr. Rogers had said, look for the helpers. Well, we also would talk specifically in this fits right in with our social emotional learning is it feels very hopeless when you feel helpless. What can we do right now to help someone that we can see and impact immediately? And
again, in the present,
yes, right?
It's again rooted in the present. Think about, there's a story about Mother Teresa that somebody said, how do you look at all of the global issues and how do you not feel overwhelmed and hopeless about the situation? And she said something to the effect of, I'm concerned with the one in front of me. That's the next one. I can't think about everybody, who's in front of me and what do they need. And I think if we took that approach in education, which is at the end of the day, what we did at Anastasis, who's in front of us, how well do we know them, and how are we responding to the very real moment that is right now?
And because we modeled that, we also helped them learn to do that. Where do we start? Well, we can start with the kids in your classroom. You can start with your families. And then we branched out a little bit. How can we help people in our community? So we would go on to service learning trips. And we would sometimes service learning might have been the simplest thing, like going and reading stories to a horse, but it helped the people in that particular area to know that we were coming and there was something that they could do that would help the horses that were in their care. I mean, again, that seems really superfluous, but I look at it as...
I think about how often we are teaching some of these social emotional curriculums about, what it means to be lonely and what it means to, we're all of these character things. And it's like, well, who do you notice on the playground that is not, doesn't have somebody right now? And what can you do about that? And those are the conversations that we would have all the time at Anastasis is like, who do you notice that might need a friend? We also talked a lot about don't assume that because your feeling is so big that everybody knows that's what's happening inside, because we can't know each other's feelings and thoughts. And so we have to ask questions and we have to speak up and advocate for ourselves. And a lot of that, that happened naturally. And the conversations that happened in metanoia and in the classrooms of, when have you felt lonely? What do you wish someone would have done? So that they're hearing from a lot of different voices and getting ideas, because sometimes we don't know what somebody else might like or need in that moment. And we had kids in those conversations say, sometimes I actually just need a minute and I like to be alone. And so it was like, oh, So we could ask, do you
Even-
want to be alone or do you want to be invited?
Even practicing how to disagree or how to tell someone that what you just did is a problem. We practiced that. We used social stories sometimes in the midst of reading or learning about something else that might have been historical. Again, it all fit in and there were so many connections. But then practicing it, because as an adult, I can remember what to do sometimes when I'm upset. Sometimes I can't. And when you see a kid starting to really build up with some rage and all they want to do is start pointing fingers and yelling, if you've practiced with them, you can help them to say, when you did this to me, it hurt me physically or it hurt my feelings or whatever, to be able to say it in a way that allowed them to express their feelings, that they were angry or that they were hurt, but to do it in a way that wasn't instant, like blaming and shaming. And then you had like an argument on your hands, right?
I think it's also important over time, over the years, we learned that they can't always have the discussion in the moment because they're not regulated.
Right.
And so we learned that sometimes giving them a task, like carrying something to the office or doing something heavy, taking a walk while we talked, bouncing a ball, doing something physical so that their bodies could regulate. So then they could have those conversations was huge. And that, like I said, isn't something I didn't know that when we started Anastasis, that was a learning that happened along the way.
Those are things that I just look back and think, not only as a kid, but I wish I'd had those tools as a young adult, even now. Yeah. There are times when I slip back into some of those really old bad habits. And then after the fact, I'm ashamed about my behavior or how I reacted. And I can avoid all of that if I just go back into, these are the things that I know are helpful. And I can have a conversation with, if I'm having an argument with my husband or something, it's something simple to say, I'm not blaming you. This is what happened. This is why I reacted. Can we have a discussion about that? That's what adults can do. Teaching kids how to manage their big feelings in a way that's not only helpful for them to process it, but also to be in a relationship, with another human being, is to still show respect, even when I'm angry at you. Or I'm super happy and I can't control myself. There are lots of different things.
I think that we put people in groups and assume that we will figure out how to be in community well together. And the reality is that we as a society are not good at navigating community.
No. It takes practice.
It takes practice and it takes intention. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we have enough places where that intention is played out. And I think school is a great place to learn all of that, because you're in a place with lots of different people who you haven't been in community with before. And all kinds of challenges are going to happen throughout the day. Like, it's the perfect place to learn it. I don't think that we do it well in most places. No. And it's not to say that that's true exclusively, because you and I have been in schools that do this tremendously well. And that's, we've learned from other educators and other practitioners and other walks of life.
Yeah.
And even through some of the places that we took the kids on field trips, that it was like, oh, that's, some of those cultural pilgrimages where we're sitting in a Hindu temple and we're talking with Tusha and we're like, this is really peaceful in a way I wasn't anticipating, and learning about what makes that true. Right? There were places that were unexpected, I think, where we also learned that the kids were getting it and we were doing it in real time in the present together.
Well, even I think back to when you instituted like the postures of learning for different spaces. We showed kids that in this room, it's okay to just, lie down on the floor or be in a very quiet space where you're not disturbing anybody else. In this room, it's set up more for collaboration and talking. This one might be sitting at a desk, but you're with a lot of other people. There are so many different ways to have learning space. But I also think that a lot of the trips that we took kids on also showed them it's not just about postures of learning, it's postures of behavior also. Yeah. I will behave differently. Yeah. If I go to a symphony concert, it is important for me not to be a distraction to the people on the stage in the concert. So my posture and my behavior is different than what it might look like if I go to the baseball field and watch,
And I just want to call out, you guys as teachers were so good at prepping kids for what that posture was going to look like, so that it wasn't the reprimand in the theater because they were doing the wrong thing, right? It was setting them up for success to say, in this kind of a space, this is how we act.
Well, even just asking the question, why do you think it's important for us to be quiet at a concert compared to loud at a baseball game?
Yes.
And they came up with those answers.
And for kids, especially on the spectrum, but I'm like, I see this in myself, which might tell you something, but for somebody to tell me the rules of engagement socially in places is so comforting for me, because I'm not left to guess, is this the right or wrong thing? Or, do I look like a fool right now? Those kind of it gives that safety as well, knowing what they're stepping into, knowing what the expectation and how that looks and what cues you might be picking up. And you're right, it was a discussion that was like, what might be important for people who are playing instruments, what could be distracting, what, it was asking them those questions and having them reflect on, oh yeah, if I was doing that, that would be really distracting if people were having a side conversation or.
Well, I think it just, as you kind of alluded to, it's, it's stressful not to know how to behave in a certain way or what the expectations are if they've not been shared with you. And going to something for the very first time and not knowing when I was younger, like when I was really little, I was a very, very quiet and shy kid. And I would just basically make myself invisible. And everyone kind of mistook that for good behavior.
Yep, same.
So I remember my aunt took me to a party that was, all of her adult friends. And I went, and I think I even brought this up on a podcast before, but there was a room full of kids they were watching Bedknobs and Broomsticks, the movie, which I really wanted to watch. And they're like, oh, do you want to go with those kids? But I didn't know those kids. I knew my aunt, and I was more comfortable being silent next to her than not knowing
doing the thing that I wanted to do. Yeah.
So I think that a lot of times with, not knowing how to behave, kids are going to do different things. For me, it was make yourself small and invisible. Other kids, they're going to act out or somewhere in between. And if we just help them to learn what it's supposed to look like and hear expectations, and that might be, in some places, there's a pretty broad set of expectations, so you don't have to say it has to be this way. But helping them to know and prepare alleviates a lot of anxiety and stress over just guessing, because what if I guess wrong?
Well, and to your point of the different postures of learning that we kind of defined in different spaces, so they knew if I want just a quiet space that I can count on it being quiet, I know where to go. If I'm going to collaborate, I know I'm going to use that other space so that I don't create a problem and get in trouble in this space.
Right.
It was those kind of, you're just helping it to go better. And you think about in most classrooms, sometimes they're so multi-purpose that sometimes it's okay to collaborate. Sometimes if I am talking, I'm in trouble. Sometimes it's okay to get up and out of my seat. And sometimes I'm going to get yelled at. For kids, the adults think that that's obvious when those times are.
Right.
And it's really not. They're experiencing it all for the first time. They don't know all the norms yet. They're not picking up on all the social cues. And because we haven't defined postures of learning and it is multi-purpose, it's really confusing where it's like, well, how come 10 minutes ago when I was talking, it was okay and suddenly it's not now?
Right.
Is really confusing.
It's a lot of mixed messages, and you're asking, again, a brain that is not fully developed to read the room and know exactly when it's okay and when it's not to automatically do that. It's like that maturity switch we're supposed to just flip on when they reach a certain age. And that's not how it happens. And again, I'll go back to my driving the car analogy from earlier. You would never say, okay, I'm only going to teach you about this until you're 16. And okay, now go. You know everything you're supposed to know. And you didn't give them time to practice any of it in a safe area. I mean, there's a reason that a lot of kids learn how to drive in a parking lot when it's empty, because the risk for damage is pretty small, right?
Yeah.
We have to give kids time to practice those social and emotional skills in a space where it's safe to make a mistake and to be corrected in a way that feels safe. And like, I'm not going to be penalized for my mistakes. It's not going to hurt.
Well, and I think it's funny that the very people who are like, by doing these things, you're going to make them soft, you're going to make them whatever, they won't know how to do this because it's always been defined for them. No, it's the training wheels where they're learning the actual skills. They're becoming more aware of others and themselves, which means I would put our kids, and we heard this from the high schools and the places that they go after us, that are like, you have the most compassionate, aware, empathetic, thoughtful kids come out of Anastasis. And it's like, I agree. It's because we cared about that. We even defined that on our report, quote unquote, report card, right? We cared enough to measure and pay attention to it, which then created the conditions where we asked better questions about how we were setting up spaces, how we were interacting in daily small moments, what the learning looked like. All of that was grown out of defining what it is we cared about and then making choices based on what we cared about to set up the environment where all of that could be true. And not just because we were like, put it in our mission statement and then
check off that box.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to, I said it before, even if you're going to do social emotional learning for the most selfish reasons, that is to get kids to be as productive as they possibly can, right? And so it looks good on your tests. That's the reason to do it. Because when you have kids who are in a safe place, emotionally, socially, they are going to be able to perform better. That's on a purely selfish level. If you truly care about the kids, then
you're going to do that anyway.
Yes.
I was going to say, I think we brought it up in a previous episode. I can't remember which one, but the kiddo who did the nectar screening and the cognitive skills and all the scores were pretty low. Brilliant kid, but everything was really low. We knew the anxiety was high. After a year with us, I don't think it's because we changed everything in the world, but we created the conditions where he felt safety, belonging, and the anxiety dropped significantly. And suddenly all of the scores were reflective of really what he was capable of. And it was being masked by that anxiety. And so I think you're right. Even if it's purely for selfish reasons of we want to raise scores, okay, great, do that. But make it don't bring it in as an add-on afterthought, one more thing we're going to do and one more worksheet you're going to fill out or lesson or whatever. Ground it in authenticity, because I do think that kids see through the bolt-on. That doesn't feel authentic. That feels like a rule now.
Right. One more thing I got to take a test over, right? Yeah. I really think, again, you mentioned earlier that we know so many incredible educators, and if we could just help give them the space to do the things that are good for kids, to get to be able to have a class size that's manageable enough. I'm not even going to say do what we did at Anastasis with 12 kids in a class. I know not every school can do that. But the more kids you put onto a teacher's class load, you're giving that teacher less time to get to know each of those kids as an individual. And that is so important. There's one thing that we know that we could help make SEL in school more successful. It's to give kids time with the adults to really get to know them. You can't do that when you're on a schedule of you've got to be on this page by this day, by this month, whatever. It really needs to be, what do we know about these kids? How can we, I'm not saying you've got to love every single child that comes past you. That's not realistic. You can care for every child that comes past you. There's a difference there. And again, I think it's the lack of nuance in the word love. I really truly believe if we had enough adults who felt like they could care for kids in a way that was meaningful, we would see a lot of difference in how education looked.
I think if we did nothing else, that one piece
I agree.
would completely transform. Like if you're looking for a magic bullet, is it easy? No. It's going to come with all sorts of, when you know kids, it'll come with other things because now you know more, right? So you're going to make different decisions and you're going to shift things. And that's what we learned, is that by getting to know the individuals in front of us, we made decisions based on who was in our care, and our learning changed based on who was in our care. And then that impacted the kids in the future, right? That we had later. But yeah, it does make me sad when we reduce things down so much to the soundbite that we miss being able to do the meaningful work because we're so focused in the wrong places.
Right. We miss out on the joy. We really do.
Yeah.
It becomes this hard thing to suffer through instead of, I can think of so many. I've taught hundreds of kids in my career. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And I can think back to so many kids, especially when I didn't have, 80 in a class, which I did sometimes, but, and I could smile over this little personality thing on this one, and this one who had the questions and the curiosity. And I can think back to all of these things, but I can really think back to very specific details about the kids when I was able to spend more time getting to know them, not just as learners, but as human beings.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, because we're in the business of academics and learning, that's where the focus gets put, is on, it just is the wrong starting point, I think.
So let's fix that.
Shall we?
I think we could challenge anybody listening. What is one thing that you could do to make a difference for a student or all of your students, depending on what capacity you serve, and that you could change without leaving the constraints that you're in? What's one thing that you could do to really focus on that and make a difference that's a positive influence for that child? That's my challenge.
Yeah, that's a good challenge. I like it. Well, we talked longer than we always talk longer than I anticipate. I should just know that that's what's going to happen. But if anybody made it this long, congratulations. And thank you for listening.
Thanks. Yeah.
But yeah, onward.
Onward.
Hey, Michelle, where else can people find you online?
I blog at avenue4learning.com, and the 4 is the actual number 4, not the word 4, avenue4learning.com.
And you can find me at dreamsofeducation.wordpress.com, which is my original blog. You can also find me at ktsplace.com, which is where I share a bunch of resources and kind of projects that we're currently working on. And we are both on Blue Sky at the moment, but not as active as we once were on our favorite bird. Come find us and connect with us in other places, and we look forward to connecting with you.